This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. So in the last podcast, I was talking about the role of military expenditures and increasing and ever expanding military expenditures and engagements as part of a process of what I will call expanding the mass. And in an earlier podcast, I talked about a bit about the fact that the basic dynamic of capital is very much about the tendency towards a falling rate of profit and a rising mass of profit at the same time, which is a sort of contradiction, but a neat contradiction to work with. But when we start to look at the rising mass, what do we see? We see that, say, the gross domestic product in the world was something like 9 trillion in 1950, and it's now close to 90 trillion. It's increased tenfold since the 1950. We can see something like the mass of greenhouse gas emissions, which for 800,000 years was never greater than 300 parts per million. Went past that in 1960 and is now close to 420 parts per billion. So the mass of greenhouse gas is up there. You take something like the mass of plastics. The plastics invented in 1950. Plastic started to become very, very common after 1973 when they came up with the kind of plastic that could actually hold carbonated drinks. And so plastic bottles came in, but plastic does not easily get recycled. Plastics don't dissolve very easily. And so we have about 800,000 tons of waste plastic now around the world, and it's been increasing at the rate of 8% a year. And you kind of say, well, pretty soon we'll all be sort of smothered in plastics. And the one form of plastic which has emerged recently, which is bothering people, or maybe bothering people, is the way in which plastics do dissolve very slowly in the face of sunlight, but create plastic polymers, which are very, very, very small particles, which can now be found anywhere, Mount Everest, the Rocky Mountains, everywhere. And we're surrounded now with plastic polymers of certain kinds. So again, the rising mass of plastic waste is there. The rising mass of air travel is kind of interesting. If you look up until the pandemic struck, there was a rapid expansion in that, the rapid rise of tourism between 2007 and 2019. I think it went from around 800 million trips, international trips, to 1.4 billion in about 3 or 4 years. You look at the new forms of consumption like cruise ships and things like that. So you kind of see a society where the expansion of the mass is going on and on and on. And Engels, I think, was very fond of talking about one of the principles of dialectics is the transformation from quantity into quality. That is, small quantitative changes which build incrementally at a certain point produce a qualitative shift, a qualitative transformation. The obvious example of this is the way in which water is where it is until it gets at a temperature where suddenly it becomes ice. And of course, you can't walk, or at least I can't walk, and maybe you can, but I can't walk on water, but you can walk on ice. So the transformation, the qualitative transformation that can come out of small quantitative changes is a very important. So the question I would like to pose right now is, to what degree have we experienced a qualitative transformation because of the rising quantity of all of these things, the rising quantity of money, the rising quantity of debt, the rising quantity of GDP, the rising quantity of military expenditures and military engagements, the rising quantity of greenhouse gas emissions, the rising quantity of plastic waste, and so on. And if there is a qualitative transformation, what does that qualitative transformation amount to? And what are the signs of this qualitative transformation? And one of the arguments that I've been making is that one of the ways in which the mass is disposed of these days is to dispose of it in non-productive ways. And last time I talked about the non-productive ways in which surplus is being disposed of through the defense industries, and that is really rather massive contribution to surplus absorption. But the other thing that I have mentioned is the way in which the surplus value and surplus gets absorbed in the production of what Marx called fixed capital of an independent kind. And when he talked about that, he talked about fixed capital, which was both movable and some of it immovable. And he then connected this to the creation of what he called a consumption fund. Now, just to give you an example of what he's talking about, when we talk about fixed capital of an independent kind and immovable kind, and consumption fund, think of something like the transport industry. The transport industry for Marx was an industry that was value producing because it was selling change of location. But then you say, well, what are the things going on in the transport industry? The fixed capital of an independent kind, which is immovable because it's put into the land. The fixed capital of an independent kind consists of the ports and the harbors, the roads and the highways, the airports, and all of the physical features which are required for the transportation system to operate. So you can kind of say, well, all of that is embedded in the land, the airports and the ports and the railway stations and the rails and everything, that's all embedded in the land. And that's a very large investment. Probably in a given year, you're talking about 5% of the total investment in the society is simply about investing in fixed capital of an independent kind, which is immobilized in the built environment. But that you've then got fixed capital, which is mobile. And the mobile fixed capital are the trucks and the trains and the ships and the scooters and the bicycles and all the rest of it. Again, and the cars and so on. And again, this is a very large investment, so that you would say maybe 10% of the economy is taken up with fixed capital of an independent kind, which is embedded in the environment, and fixed capital of a mobile kind, which is not embedded in the environment, which can be moved around. Although the rails, a steam engine can only, or electric engine can only go on a rail track. So that's it. Now, then Marx kind of said, but the interesting thing about these items of transportation is that they can be used not only for production, so that we don't only use a road for conveying commodities. We also use the road for consumption. That is for pleasure, for taking walks and the like. So Marx kind of says, so we have to think of something here, which is all of the money which is going into the production of a consumption fund. So let's think about the consumption fund. The consumption fund is going to be used jointly with, when it comes to roads, it's going to be used jointly with the producers. So part of the time it's going to be used for pleasure, part of the time it's going to be used for production. And there are many other aspects of the built environment which are subject to joint uses. Water supply, for example, is going to go into production. It's also going to go into the consumption fund. Sewage disposal is going to have its roots in production, but also is involved in consumption. So the consumption fund then is partly going to be used jointly with productive capital, but also in the consumption fund you have some very, very large items. Housing is one of the large items, and cars is another. Of course, cars can be used for production as well as for consumption, but for the most part, we would argue that they're used for consumption. So cars, And then there's a fixed capital immobilized in the consumption fund, and we think about hospitals, we think about schools, we think about cultural centers, we think about educational institutions like universities, and so on. So if you add up all of that, you would kind of say, what proportion of activity in society is actually given over to the development of the consumption fund and the development of fixed capital in these immovable fixed forms, built environment and so on, and of course in these movable forms as well. So most recently, of course, we have seen a really spectacular example of this in China, where there are during the 1990s, well, during the 2000s, up and particularly after 2008, 2009, there was this huge building boom in China, in which construction of both the consumption fund and fixed capital accounted for something like 30% of the economy, and 15% of that were taken up by housing alone. So here you have a mass of activity. And I quote my favorite statistic that came out of this, that the Chinese in 2 years consumed 45% more cement, which happens to be a very greenhouse gas emitting commodity, but 45% more in 2 years than the United States consumed in 100 years. Now, this is the kind of thing that Engels talks about when he talks about, at what point is this going to freeze over? Just to use the analogy of the water. I mean, is this going to be a case where the capitalist hell at some point or other will freeze over? And if it freezes over, of course, it ceases to have motion. And if it ceases to have motion, then you have a huge, huge crisis on your hands, because the things cannot move anymore. And a lot of what is going on in terms of this capital investment is about creating immovability. Now, here's an interesting contradiction within the nature of capitalism, because capitalism has always been about mobility. It's always been about acceleration, moving faster, going quicker, and getting things done quicker. And so what we see in telecommunications and what we see in transportation, for example, is you go from the horse and buggy, and you go to the railway, and then you go to the internal combustion engine, you then go to the jet engine, and you then go to the sort of electronic forms of communication where you get virtual transfers going on. So you kind of say, well, actually, capital has always been about speed up. Well, yes, it's always been about speed up, but it's now investing more and more in immobile fixed capital, which is actually sunk capital. Now, the point about sunk capital is, how do you recuperate the value of the sunk capital? Well, part of it is recuperated by the people who build it. So, for example, if you build a new airport, then the construction interests come in, the designers, the furnishing people and so on all come in, and they get involved in producing the airport. And so they have a very, very good market for their business, and they build the airport. At the end of the day, the airport is complete. Who is now going to use the airport? Well, they're only going to use it if the airport can actually generate some traffic, and if they can charge user fees for people using the airport. You can charge the airlines and all the rest of it. But in order for the airport to be viable economically, there has to be enough traffic. So the airline industry has to expand in order to actually meet the demand. So there's enough traffic for the airport, so the airport can be viable, and that actually somebody will want to invest in the airport, own the airport, because they can extract from it user fees in all sorts of ways, and make a good living out of the ownership of the airport. So, but in order for that to happen means that you have to be prepared to keep the airlines flying all of the time for, 20 or 30 years until the total value of the airport is recuperated. But what happens when a pandemic comes along and you can't use the airport anymore? Because there's no and because nobody's going to fly anymore. So all of those industries have got into very, very grave difficulty during the pandemic, because the motion was not there to support the fixed capital which had been invested in the airports. So this is the kind of dilemma which it seems to me that we're confronting now. The pandemic, therefore, is giving us a bit of a lesson about the valuation of fixed capital. Right now, of course, we're saying, well, we're going to keep it valued somehow artificially. We're going to sort of pay the investors so that they don't lose too much over the fact that the airport can't be used. So there's all these funds being generated. But again, where's the funding coming from? Well, it's coming from actually the production of money. And here, too, we have a qualitative, quantitative thing. One of the things we've seen is, of course, the increase of the money supply. Now, bit by bit, bit by bit, bit by bit, is there going to be a qualitative shift where one of these days so much of the money supply has become irrelevant, as it were, to the economy that we don't actually, we're not able to use it in ways which are going to validate a lot of the other trade and a lot of the need for validation that exists in the fixed capital investment. The same is true with housing. The same is true about hospitals and all the rest of it. In other words, the dynamics of a capitalist economy are supposed to be about mobility and about growth and about acceleration. But increasingly, capitalism is becoming sclerotic because it's got fixed investments in the built environment which need to be validated, need to be valorized, as Marx would say. They need to be valorized by their use and the payment for that use. And this tension is all around us. Now, I find it hard right now to imagine how this is going to evolve, particularly in the wake of what may be the end of this war, which is going on in Ukraine, because one of the things that has been done in order to punish Russia is that we've frozen a lot of economic activity coming in and out of Russia. We're actually trying to reduce them back to what the circumstances from which they came in 1991-92. That is, one in which they may actually find the ruble is no longer worth anything, and on international markets it's down to almost nothing. And they're going to go back to bottles of vodka or something like that in order to exchange, except that now people are boycotting Russian vodka, though that won't necessarily last. So the issue, I think, here is that when we start to think about how we're going to come out of what has just been done, at what point will there be a relaxation of these sanctions? And in particular, what is now recognized is how these sanctions actually do not secure your future. That is, the fact that the Russians have a huge amount of dollar deposits, but they can't use it because it's sanctioned and locked up. Who has the power to do that? And where is that power located? And what will happen when people start to say that power should not be located in the United States in the way that it is located right now? Because in a sense, it is the US dictating to the world, much as they tried to do in the wake of the war in Iraq, dictating to the world how the world should behave and how it should be. And this is what is called US leadership, which is US actually dictating to the world what shall be done and how it shall be done. And there, I think you're likely to find very considerable resistance emerging. The emergence of coalitions which are against the United States. And I think that actually we've already, in a way, moved into what might be called another bipolar world. That is, the world of NATO and the world of opposition to NATO. Now, I'm in opposition to NATO internally within the United States. I want it to be used to stop Putin. I want it to be used to make sure Ukraine is liberated and emancipated so that it can actually create its own economy in its own particular way. I would want that. But once that mission is accomplished, I want to see the vehicle that allowed that to be accomplished to be dissolved. And that requires a peace movement, which is going to actually look at very clearly the role of military expenditures as another element of the mass. So what we've got, it seems to me, coming up is a big question in the next few years, which is, to what degree is this mass going to continue to increase at an exponential rate? And what are the costs of that expansion? And how is that expansion occurring? Is it becoming, to make it things more, move faster and more mobile? Or is it coming to be more sclerotic, more heavy, more difficult to move? And to what degree is it going to become weighed down by its own investment structures? This is a sort of problem which, it seems to me, is looming in the not too distant future. I'm a very pessimistic, in a sense, about the future of capital at this particular moment, because I think the mass which is required to revive capital accumulation in the style to which it was going before the invasion, before the pandemic, for that to happen, it seems to me there's an almost impossible task of restoration of a mass which is almost impossible to accommodate, given the barriers and the fact that we only have a single globe with which to work, only one single climatic regime which is available to us, only one system of economy which is available to us, which is the capitalist accumulation system. Clearly, the case for an alternative is very strong, and that is entirely why I would want to call this podcast. This is where we're talking about the anti-capitalist possibilities, the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, and where they come from and where they might go to. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.